amigos y bienvenidos a este vuestro programa Dos gatos en tierra de perros. Un podcast de actualidad donde analizamos de manera fáctica y neutral las noticias más relevantes de la política y cultura norteamericana.
Hello, I'm Joe Magaha. Thank you, friends, for being with me for another episode of Dos Gatos en Tierra de Perros. Today, I have with me the author, activist, journalist, and filmmaker, Derrick Broze. Welcome, Derrick.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you. Your story is fascinating. There's a lot of questions I have for you, but I guess if we could, let's start by having you tell me a little bit about how you got started in activism and what took you down this path.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm currently living in Mexico, but I'm originally from Texas, and I grew up in Texas. I got into trouble in Texas at a young age. I, got addicted to drugs. I struggled with depression at a young age, struggled with suicide attempts and things like that, eventually getting into drug and alcohol use at the end of my high school career. I went into college and just started partying a lot, and eventually I got addicted to crystal meth at 20 years old. And by the time I was turning 21 in December 2005, almost 20 years ago, I was getting arrested, and I was arrested with a felony charge. And between November 2005 and October 2008, I would do 19 months in Texas state prisons, doing a year, getting out for 5 or 6 months, going back and kind of doing that back and forth. But it was really in prison, in that experience, that I decided I needed to figure out what I was going to do with my life, because I come from a family of drug addicts and alcoholics, unfortunately, on both sides of my family. I grew up visiting my birth father in prison, and that did cause a lot of trauma to me at a young age and a lot of confusion. So when I found myself in that same situation, being arrested for drugs, I decided I needed to do whatever it took to change the course of my life. And it was in prison that I discovered meditation. I discovered prayer and sort of started opening up spiritually, you could say. And as far as my politics at that time, as a young man, I was definitely not somebody who trusted the government or anything like that. I would guess you could say, like a rebel or a radical without a cause, right? I had this sort of anti-authoritarian, maybe intuition, but not any philosophical understanding of, or, really historical or political understanding of the world at large. I was just angry and young. But as I started to do some of that healing work while I was in prison, and then afterwards, and coming out into Texas now as a felon because of my drug charge, I had to experience, what that meant. And that led to, for example, me not being able to get apartments or houses in certain parts of the city who don't want to rent to felons, being turned down for jobs numerous times because I was a felon, and just trying to navigate that. And although that was a struggle, I was also probably the happiest I'd ever been, because when I went to prison and when I started working on my healing and my trauma, I think the depression started to lift, the confusion started to lift. And at 23 years old, when I got out, I was probably the happiest I'd ever been. I was also broke and a felon, but I was still just very happy to be alive and to be free. And it was in that space of kind of opening up spiritually, and then my depression disappearing, and looking at the world with a fresh set of eyes, that I started to get into activism. At first, I was going to the library all the time, applying for jobs, again, as a felon, and getting turned down for jobs. And one day I decided to check out a book from the library, and it was all about the U.S. drug war, and how the origins of the drug war in the United States are largely based around oil, money, racism, various things like that. It was an education that I didn't get in my high school or community college courses. And it was something that was very eye-opening for me. It was actually that book that I checked out from the library was the first book that I ever voluntarily took notes and did a report on, just for my own understanding, because I was just so enthralled by it. And then from there, I just started looking around and asking questions like, what else is it that I wasn't taught, in my formal education? What else is there out in the world? And while all that was going on and I was getting out, I moved into downtown Houston. So I started getting involved a lot with the music and art scene. I've always been a musician and a promoter. And so I started hosting concerts that were fundraisers for the homeless population or anti-war shows and things like that. And that was really where my activism started. And eventually that evolved into me starting a community activist community called the Houston Freethinkers. And we were active from about 2010 to 2017. We did a lot of great things, everything from protests, marches, and rallies to feeding the homeless to raising money for different organizations, victims of domestic violence. We had a community house where we would host skill shares and documentary screenings and potluck dinners and all kinds of fun stuff. It was all just about trying to build community on the local level and trying to raise awareness about corruption where we saw it. And it was in that pursuit of my activism that I started to meet some of the local media in Houston and started to see that they weren't really doing their job. And we had an incident where we actually became the focal point of the news, where a police officer ended up pulling a shotgun on some of our community members and pointing it at us. And that made the news and went viral. And I ended up getting on Alex Jones's show back in 2011, 2012, and that made the news. And all the news reported that we were a, quote, local group of conspiracy theorists. And so that really quickly showed me that I couldn't trust the media. And that was sort of the seed planted for me to get into journalism and to start to take it, pretty seriously. At first, it was just citizen journalism, little handheld camera, going up to cops and asking questions or just documenting protests. And as I said, as I could see more and more of the lack of journalism coming from the corporate media, I decided it was something I wanted to take more seriously. And I've been doing that now for about 11 years, getting paid to write articles and branching off into writing books and producing documentaries. And I ran for mayor of Houston a couple of times to try to raise awareness. I'm here in Mexico now, and we're hosting events. All of my forms of activism and journalism and the things that I do are all very much geared to trying to educate and empower people about the problems that we have in our world. And then most importantly, trying to see what discussions we can have about solutions, not just trying to focus on the problems and tell people how horrible the world is, but trying to come up with, valuable ideas that we as individuals and as communities on the local level can do to tackle the problems that we see. So, and in that process, I ended up launching a website called The Conscious Resistance in 2013. The Conscious Resistance Network is what I call it. And that's where I've been posting my articles, my podcasts and documentaries. And we have a team of contributors that, come and go, people who share the similar idea of bringing together, again, the need for healing our trauma, the need for working on some of the deeper issues that humanity struggles with collectively and on the individual level. And so pairing that spiritual healing and spiritual growth with the promoting freedom and liberty on the physical plane and the bridging of those two worlds, because I do believe in order for us to, in the long term, create a better world than the one that we're currently in and to leave something better for the coming generations, that we do need a combination of the struggle and the fight for freedom in the physical realm, that we're all familiar with, against corporations and governments and various bad actors, as well as we need the fight for freedom in our own internal world, what I call the internal tyrant, our own doubts, fears, insecurities, and limiting beliefs, which can really hold us back and sometimes prevent us from being the best person that we can be. So the Conscious Resistance has been my home for my content and everything that I do. And it's also the title of my first 3 books, the Conscious Resistance Trilogy, which explores those ideas in more depth. So that's a little bit about what I do.
That's amazing. It's really crazy. I kind of got involved in or followed politics more during the 2016 presidential campaign. I was a big Bernie bro, as they say, even though that was a total myth. But I also kind of became aware of all the censorship that was going on with the press, where the press really is just a stenographer for governments and for corporations. And now, from what I understand, the Biden administration wants to get rid of the First Amendment and basically control anything that goes out to the public. Is there censorship like that, or attempts at censorship? I know it's also going on in Europe. I know in Europe they're trying to control all the information that goes out, and you can even, you can be put in jail for saying the wrong thing, or be fined. There are a lot of things going on in Spain right now with that. is anything like that going on in Mexico? And are you basically free to say or do whatever say whatever you think your impressions are of what's going on in Mexico and in the world?
Mexico is a delicate situation. So as I said, I'm not from Mexico originally. My partner is. I've been visiting Mexico for the last 8 years and living here since 2020. And I'm really grateful for a lot of the things about the country. Of course, Mexico is notorious for cartel violence and essentially organized crime, which is active, I would say, behind, around the country. It's not something that like, for example, where I live in Morelia in the central Mexico. I go to the gym, I go on walks, we go out to eat. We never see violence in our day-to-day activity, but I'm sure it's behind the scenes, right? And just like the United States and other places where organized crime is still active despite what people believe. In terms of freedom of speech, I do feel like there is a certain level of freedom of speech that is similar to the United States in many ways, where people can go out and protest, people can march, you can write articles, you can go to press conferences and question the president and things of that sort. Now, of course, have been many deaths of journalists in Mexico over the years who have reported on cartel activity specifically. That is the major danger here in Mexico. It's not so I would say, like, you have freedom of speech, but there are definitely certain topics where people have lost their lives over. And again, I think that more specifically pertains to activities of the various cartels. And, cartel is just, of course, a broad term. There's numerous different small local gangs and bigger, real criminal syndicates that are operating on the international level and things of that sort. But by and large, I do think that you have the freedom of speech that most people are looking for. Now, it's unfortunate, of course, that I would have to, in this country, if I would say I had a big breaking story or somebody coming to me about something related to cartels and government agencies or something, I would have to second guess whether or not I would publish that while living in Mexico. It might be safer to leave Mexico and go publish that. And even then, you never really know, because these cartels, syndicates do have international reach in many cases. And I will say one other troubling thing that I've seen I think it's been happening the last couple years, but it still seems to be an ongoing case. There is a Mexican official who happens to be transgender, who was criticized by another Mexican official, a politician, or perhaps the one who criticizes a former politician. But the one who is being criticized, the transgender individual, is a currently serving politician. And this other person publicly misgendered them, if you will. And I guess they attacked them, not violently, not threats of violence, but they essentially didn't address them by their preferred pronouns. And that official actually faced punishment. I don't know if he was sent to jail, but I do know that he was forced to pay a fine. And this is still like an ongoing case where he is trying to fight this and appealing to international organizations and stuff like this, because obviously, whatever your thoughts on people being transgender and their freedom to choose to be whatever they want, I definitely think it's problematic when you get into the point where the state is empowered to go after people if they don't use someone's proper pronouns. To me, that's like a total wrong direction to go in. So seeing that about Mexico is definitely not the most positive development. And I'm following that story now to see where it leads.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. I mean, I follow a lot of different independent journalists, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, people like that, Aaron Mate. But I also follow comedians like Tim Dillon, and he recently said about the younger generation, because he's gay, but he said that, when he was growing up, basically he was taught you be you, and anybody who doesn't accept you can go to hell, but now it's you be you, and you convince everybody else to accept you. And he said that sounds, for one thing, like an exhausting task, and it sounds like a miserable way of life, because you're not going to be able to get everybody to accept you. So it's kind of crazy, but yeah, I think that all of this suppression is causing a reaction on the other side, because people can see that when thought is being controlled or attempted to be controlled, they can't really control our thoughts, but when
Not
speech
yet,
is
at least.
exactly when speech is controlled to the point where you can't really say what you think, especially in the United States, which is supposed to be the land of the free, the home of the brave. Um, it becomes an Orwellian nightmare where people, and then it just forces anybody who, even like bad people, to go underground, because you kind of want people to say what they think, because then you know who they are too.
Yeah, absolutely. I've tended to always feel in my life that if I'm dealing with a racist or a bigoted person, or people are free to have whatever views they want, but I would rather know what that person believes, and then I can make my appropriate decisions, right? I could say, okay, well, this business person clearly doesn't like people of a certain skin color or a certain nationality or ethnicity, and I think that's just stupid, so I'm no longer going to give them my business. But if we try to make racists afraid, is one of the things I hear, which I think I get the mentality behind it. It's like, yeah, stupid people should be afraid to say stupid opinions. And at the same time, I think that there is that benefit that you're describing to actually knowing what people believe. And then we can make appropriate decisions in the human marketplace. Like, do I want to collaborate, work with, support, be friends with, etc., somebody who I know has these ugly views? No, I don't. But at least I know where they stand, and I can make an appropriate decision, instead of them being so maybe terrified, or the law getting involved, and people being afraid to express themselves, no matter how ugly their opinions are. And for sure, people are ugly. I get some ugly emails every now and then related to my skin color, or people assuming that I'm not from the US and go back to Mexico, or just so stupid things that honestly I just kind of laugh off. But it doesn't really affect me like that. But it's still like, wow, I'm glad to know that this idiot thinks this way. I'm going to block them. I'm going to, move on with my life. But yeah, I think that's the danger of where we're at now, where some people, mostly those on the progressive side of things in the United States and the Western world, think that freedom of speech means only saying things that we all agree with. And of course, who all defines what we all agree with, and gets into this collectivist mindset. And honestly, I think that is really the root of a lot of the problems that we face in the world today. This is something that I've come back to many times over the years. Of course, I'm not the first person to point it out, but it's something that does seem to keep rearing its head, is that ultimately we're dealing with a collectivist versus an individualist mindset. And that's not to say that it has to be that black and white. I think there's a balance. Like, I often talk about individual liberty, but also collective liberty, because I think they're both important. But I don't think that collective liberty, in the pursuit of that we should then suppress individuals to get to some idealized collective good, right? So the idea that, well, for the good of everybody, we need to silence some people so that nobody's feelings are hurt, or something like that, keeping the collective safe, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that's very dangerous thinking. And a lot of the tyrannical, psychopathic people who want control and power within government, who make their way to that career path, are individuals who will use collectivist arguments to achieve their tyrannical means. They couldn't really give a crap about the collective good and taking care of the people. But if it suits their purposes, then absolutely they will argue that this individual is doing something wrong, and for the interest of the collective, we need to suppress this person's freedom of speech, or we need to lock them away, or we need to punish them, or et cetera, et cetera. And you can see this collectivist mindset have been used by the Nazis, by communists, by different tyrannical, totalitarian groups throughout history. It's not something new, but I think it is something we need to pay attention to.
Yes, for sure. And I think that the powers that be are demonizing people on the right too. They're calling basically anybody who follows Trump, they're calling a racist, which is crazy, because there are supporters who are Latinos, there are supporters who are Black who support Trump, and this misinterpretation, also the changing of verbiage. Basically they're saying that words equal violence, but they're also saying punch a Nazi, which if you punch a Nazi, then expect to get punched back, because they're violent people. And most of the people from Antifa that I've seen who wear the masks and sneak up on people and punch them, they don't look too tough. And if they were tough, they probably wouldn't be hiding behind a mask. But I understand that you were debanked as well. Is that correct?
Well, I've actually been voluntarily debanked since 2008. I haven't used a bank account since 2008, but I have faced what I think you're talking about in terms of being removed from platforms over the years. I haven't been as deplatformed as many of my colleagues, like Ryan Christian of Last American Vagabond, Whitney Webb, James Corbett, and some other folks who I know who have been directly impacted on PayPal. And I mean, I don't really use a lot of the other platforms, so it wasn't, there's nowhere for them to take me off of Venmo and Cash App or whatever else people use. But I stopped using banks in 2008. And originally, it wasn't really any kind of activist motivation or I'm going to stick it to the man and I'm going to withdraw my money and stuff like that. It was simply the fact that, as I said, I mean, going back to 2008, I was just getting out of prison at that time after going back and forth. And I remember I had, I guess, in those interim years of just kind of being under a haze, I had overdrawn my accounts and, not a whole lot of money, but I had gone negative in my bank accounts. And I just realized, I was like, I kind of stuck with this bank thing. Maybe I shouldn't have a banker for now. Because I was 18 at first when I first got my first bank account, didn't know what I was doing, and I withdrawal and fees and all that funny stuff. But then in 2008, when I got out, I just decided, you know what, I think I'm not going to have a bank account for a little while. And then fast forward a couple of years to what I was describing earlier about starting to kind of waking up and reading different books. I started to read about the Federal Reserve System. I started to read about war tax resistance as a way to not comply with what I would consider immoral involuntary taxation, going towards wars and surveillance and things of that sort. And once I started to become more educated about how the world really works, I ultimately decided, and this is of course going, again, 2008 financial crisis, so just a couple of years after that, and I was starting to just become educated about these things because I had been in such a haze of my own depression and drug use that I didn't know what was going on in the world. So by 2009, 2010, I'm getting educated about this. I'm learning more, getting informed, and just realizing, like, you know what? I think I don't want to go back to using banks. I think I'll figure out a way around that. So I've always used cash pretty commonly in my business. And then in 2011, also around that time, is when I decided to stop having relationships with certain U.S. government agencies and just dealing in cash, and mainly focused on being an entrepreneur. I was actually running a restaurant at the time. I was managing a restaurant, and the owner wanted me to finance it, to franchise it, and to just help him turn it into a much bigger business. And instead, I decided to quit my job and sell most of what I owned. And in January 2011, I spent 3 months traveling by bicycle. I did a bike tour, just volunteering on farms across Texas and into New Mexico. And really, this was, for me, it was a celebration of being free, because when I was locked up, I would think about, like, what am I going to do when this is all over? How can I really celebrate being free and through all this garbage and just, getting through addiction and everything. And I also got really into biking, living in the city and stuff. So I decided I'm going to do a long distance biking tour. And it ended up being some of the best times of my life, the best 3 months of my life. I learned so much about myself. And when I came back from that trip, I was just, I mean, that was the beginning of me becoming an entrepreneur. I've never worked for anybody since then. I've never had I have an editor that I work with as a journalist, but not in a traditional, workplace setting. It all kind of started there. So in 2008, I wasn't using banks. By 2010, I realized I wanted to continue that trend. I go on this trip early 2011, and I realized, like, I don't want to deal with those agencies, and I don't want to deal with banks anymore. And I came back to Houston, really just starving activist. Like, how do I make it? Okay, I know where my principles are now, but how am I going to survive in the real world, right? And that really led me to entrepreneurship and to starting different businesses. I originally started a gardening business with a friend of mine, and we were building backyard gardens for people and front yard gardens all around the city, and making good money doing that for a few years, and working odd jobs and just doing things while trying to fill the rest of my time with as much activism and citizen journalism as I can. And I got lucky enough that eventually I was able to get paid doing the work I'm doing, and the rest is history. But yeah, I mean, my desire to avoid the banks and avoid government when possible has kind of been core to what I do. And it's not something that I necessarily teach. Like, I'm not out here advocating that I have some sort of super secret strategy on how to do these things. I do talk about this in my 2020 and 2022 book. I updated it in 2020. It's called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. People can download that at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. It's available in Spanish, English, German, French, and there's an audiobook as well where I describe my particular process of living this lifestyle and trying to give people ideas on how to maybe avoid the banks if they want to, because I do think in terms of the bigger picture of some of the things that are on the horizon, like central bank digital currencies and digital identities, that these things are not going to lead to more liberty and definitely not to more privacy. And as we saw in the COVID years, the last few years, people being debanked, not by choice, debanked by authorities in Canada for donating to the truckers convoy, or people being debanked from deplatformed from PayPal and other places because they posted the wrong opinion on YouTube or on social media. And I don't think we've seen the last of those strategies. Unfortunately, I think we're just seeing the beginning of it. So a lot of my work is trying to help people navigate that. Like, how do we prepare for that strategy to be used on those of us who feel the desire to speak out? Obviously you do a podcast, right? At some point, maybe the word gets around that you're hosting a podcast with crazy conspiracy theorists and weirdos on there, and somebody doesn't like that. They decide to take you off your bank because, they don't want you to be able to profit from the work you're trying to do. These are really scary and unnerving and realistic situations that many of us may face, and many people have already faced the last few years. So my work is very much geared towards trying to help people think about opting out of these systems and seeing that as a strength as opposed to seeing it as a weakness. And so, yeah, in many ways, I debanked myself, and I haven't had to, since I don't have a bank account, they haven't been able to get me through these other ways, but I have had issues with PayPal. And so I've focused on not using that anymore. And obviously I was deleted off YouTube and plenty of other places in 2020. But so far, because I live much of my life outside dealing with cash and then using private cryptocurrencies like Monero, I am able to avoid their systems.
That's great. And I know Whitney Webb also, I think, grows her own food. Do you grow your own food as well?
Not as much as I would like. I do have land here in Mexico. We got land last year. And so our goal is to be moving on to the property hopefully by the end of this year, if not early next year. We're starting to build our house, and we have a group of people, about 6 or 7 households, that we're going to be building this community that we call the Conscious Agora. And a big part of that is permaculture. And we have a food forest there. The land's already got bananas and pomegranates and limes and pears and lots of fruit trees already thriving and growing. And we just want to add more to that. But that's definitely the goal. Even here in my house in the city, right now, myself and my partner, we're working on, just getting some more home garden stuff going on here, so we can at least, we're blessed to be in a climate where everything grows, right? So, I mean, where I live right now, this state supplies 90% of the avocados that everybody in the United States eats. So this is it's not necessarily rich in financial wealth, although Mexico does have that as well, but it's absolutely rich and abundant in food resources and a great climate to grow anything. So I want to get back to that because, like I was describing my activism in Houston, much of my early years were involved with urban farms and community gardens, and I've spent years learning how to grow food, and I love getting my hands in the soil, and it's something that I miss having access to. Actually, today when we wrap this up, I'm going to a local community garden here in the city, where they do a market every other weekend, and they sell all non-GMO organic products. They have a local seed bank. So, that's still a very big part of my life. And I'm looking forward to being able to walk outside and pick my greens again.
Nice. That sounds great. So I'm assuming, so you said you purchased some land, or you're purchasing some land. So your partner is a Mexican citizen, then? Is that correct? Because I think you have to be a citizen of Mexico to own land in Mexico, right? Or you can lease it for like 100-year lease to that kind of thing, right?
Well, no, my partner, she is actually first generation born in the U.S. Her parents are both from Mexico, so she has gotten her Mexican citizenship fairly easily. But actually, that is a bit of a miseducation that a lot of people have. You can actually own property in Mexico as a foreigner. You can't own property within 50 miles or 50 kilometers of the of the coast and of the border as a foreigner. And then there's also Mexico. It's interesting because the Mexican Revolution was only about 100 years ago, and part of that was, of course, a revolt against the hacienda system and the landowners and the class people who had the land and had peasants and stuff like that. And so a lot of that land was distributed at the end of the revolution. And so there are plenty of families and communities that have land, and many times they don't ever visit it. They've never used it. And so there's different types of property. You do have private property, deeded property, where you have a title. This is mine. I own this, et cetera. And that's registered with the government. And then there's also what they call ejido land, which is like community land, and so that can be more complicated. So, just, I guess, word of advice for anybody ever trying to buy land in Mexico: look for the private property, the deeded land, because when it comes to ejido land, like, you actually have to go get written permission from every single member of the family that owns the land. And so, like, let's say I bought it from one of the brothers of this family. Well, you could be on the land. I could have built a home, built my whole life. And 10 years later, one of the members of that family shows up and says, hey, I'm here to collect my property. So you have to literally go out and get permission from all the people who are on that community collective title. But the property we bought and that we own is titled private property land, and it's up in the mountains. And yeah, our goal is to move on it full time. I'll probably always have a place in the city because, I grew up in the city. I love the city, but also with the way the world's going, I do want to have that option to have our home on land. I don't want to pay rent for the rest of my life. I don't want to be dependent on electricity, paying a government agency or some corporation for the rest of my life. We're very much going to be focused on solar and on using permaculture and using natural building methods, which is very prevalent in Mexico. Adobe or cob is pretty much the norm out here. And yeah, we're going to build our dream community and use it as a space as well to teach about these ideas. Part of the community is a space that we call the Holistic Education Center that we're going to be building in the next couple of years, so that we can host retreats and gatherings and bring people to the property to share what we're doing, not only to say, hey, look at this beautiful piece of property, but let us teach you how we're doing that and spread and share those skills as well to further people. And I imagine with my content, as I move onto the property, I'm still going to continue to do journalism. I don't think I could ever stop, but it will absolutely start to include more of that type of content, where I'll show you guys how we're going to build our house out of cob. We're going to show you how we're going to do permaculture on a mountain and build on a slope. And what does it entail to build a food forest and these sorts of things. And I'm really excited about that, because I think that's going to be that's obviously that's a lifelong project. That's going to be something I'll be working on for years to come.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think there's a lot of doomsday stuff coming out right now. As I'm sure you know, the economy in the United States is not in good shape, even though we get all these narratives that there are all these new jobs and that, things are going great. But it doesn't look that way when you look a little deeper. And like you said, you spent a lot of time working with the homeless. The amount of homeless, well, they're saying now, and I go to Los Angeles twice a week to work, and they say the number of homeless people has gone down by like 30,000 or something like that. But I see them still every day, everywhere. And the numbers just seem to be growing. I know that part of the issue is lack of housing and the economy, but also it's mental health and drug addiction. Do you see this as possibly getting better in the future, and how?
I wish I could say that I see it getting better. I pray that it gets better, because obviously I understand the struggles of, I was homeless for a period of time when I was going through my trauma, my drug addiction and everything. I definitely understand that struggle firsthand. And this is something I learned quite a bit about in Houston when I was running for mayor, because Houston, like LA and like every other major city in the United States, now has a skid row, whether it's like one designated area or it's just under every single bridge you can find, until they move them somewhere else, and they move them somewhere else, and move them somewhere else. And the facilities that are supposed to be there, the city-owned facilities, are overwhelmed. They don't have enough space for people. They don't have, resources. And I think there's some really good work being done in this arena in terms of people trying to do what they talk about, like rapid housing, like many of the the services that are out there, like let's say you're just a regular guy, you get down on your luck, you have something going on in the family, you lose your job, before you know it, you're on the streets. I've met people who are like this, people who genuinely do want to change their circumstances. Obviously, some people don't, and they're just in their addiction and in their trauma, and they're happy where they are, or at least they believe they are. Others who are genuinely trying to seek help. And when they try to seek help, the services that are often offered, maybe they're religious, and so there might be certain restrictions, like we need you to be sober for 6 weeks before we can help you, or you got to pass 3 drug tests. And not to say there's anything wrong with wanting that from people, but the data seems to be showing that the sooner you help people, help them get off the streets, they have a much better chance of actually staying off the streets and rehabilitating themselves long term, instead of expecting them to be on the streets surrounded by craziness and stay sober and stay out of trouble. If you're able to get them off the streets, get them into housing, get them to some services and some resources, then the ones who actually do want to succeed can succeed. So, I mean, it's a massive problem that is clearly not going to be solved overnight, and it's not isolated anymore even to just the big cities. Like, I mean, I would say that the city of Houston, which is massive metroplex surrounded by a bunch of suburbs, that it used to only be in the city proper that you would find the homeless population, but now they've started to branch out further. You find people on the streets in the suburbs now. They're kind of like they're looking for support and help that way. And you go to these nice neighborhoods, and now there's a camp under the local bridge or the local highway, things like that. So it's a big problem. I empathize with the people who are dealing with it. I don't think it's going to get better before it gets worse, unfortunately, because the economy and the way things are being run, not even just under Biden, under Trump, under every U.S. president that continues the charade of the Federal Reserve System and fractional reserve banking and the central bank system itself. It's a debt-based system, so it's not going to be fixed by just continuing the charade. And obviously, when the government is sending billions and billions of dollars to Israel for bombs, or to Ukraine or wherever else, then we sit here and we wonder, well, maybe the homeless crisis could be solved if that billions went to that, right? If the billions went to things that actually affect us here, in the United States at home. And it's just another unfortunate example of how the corruption impacts our lives. Like even if you're not homeless, just by being a taxpayer, just by living in a place that is rife with corruption like the United States, things like that, common sense problems that affect people and that could be improved, do not get solved in favor of the lobbyists' pet projects or the latest, adventure war.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, there's a massive difference between the rich and the poor, especially in cities like LA, New York, Chicago, or even I'm assuming Houston. But it's getting to the point now where I think it's almost going to be like in what, it's probably not viewed well, but we used to call it third world countries, like even Brazil, where the rich people would have armed guards on every corner of their house and somebody escorting them everywhere because the poor are desperate. And it seems like it's getting to the point where it's going to be the rich 1% and then everybody else. And everybody else is going to be various levels of poverty. At this point, a young couple can't afford a house in Los Angeles just starting out. It's $1 million and up. And I think it's that way in most areas, which is why a lot of people are actually moving to Mexico or to other parts of the country.
No, absolutely. I mean, so I'm 39 right now, and like I said, I've been living in the city for most of my adult life, and it was possible even just 10, 14, 15 years ago, but as recent as 10 years ago, to be in your early to mid 20s, working in maybe a regular job, going to school, and find a nice apartment in the city for less than $1,000 or something like that, and have that place while you work your way up to the next nice place, etc. That's really not possible anymore. I mean, the last time I went and lived in Houston last summer, you're paying $1,000 for a little square box, and that's in a poor neighborhood, not in the best area. If you want to live in a nicer neighborhood, of course, you're going to pay upwards of a few $1,000s a month. And yeah, like you said, this is just not possible or reasonable for I would say a lot of my generation, not all of us, some of us have been able to navigate it, but definitely the ones coming after us, like let's say my younger brother and my nieces and nephews that are right now in their teens and going into their 20s soon. The world that they're dealing with is there's no prospects unless they get rich somehow to do what many people have considered the American dream, to go to school, work a little bit, get yourself a nice house, etc. Like it just doesn't seem to be as possible as within reach. And I definitely can say from, just experience from my generation that that is a frustrating thing to think about. Like, even if you don't want to go out and be some big homeowner, and personally, I don't want to put myself in a mortgage for the next 40 years. I'd rather do something like get land and build a home. For those who do want that lifestyle, it's not even really attainable for them anymore.
Yeah. I know a lot of people kind of get depressed at the situation now with a lot of people say we're on the verge of World War III. We've got the Ukraine war, and then we've got also what's going on in Israel, and also what's going on with the Houthis, and possible conflict with China in Taiwan. And then of course the cartels are still doing their thing, and fentanyl is coming into the United States from China through Mexico. And I understand that in Mexico, I think 36 of candidates in the last election ended up being killed as well. We talked about the violence. And I know that in the past, the CIA and the U.S. government has worked hand in hand with the cartels to help facilitate
Absolutely.
things. Yeah. So when that's the situation, it kind of makes it almost hopeless, because you can stand up to one front, one criminal front, but you can't stand up to all of them, especially when the government is actually paying for and facilitating all of this. As an ex drug addict, or I guess when you're a drug addict, they say it's kind of for life. You're just sober.
I don't buy into that BS.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't either, because basically your lifestyle is your lifestyle, and if you're not doing it now, then you're not doing it.
Yeah.
And people, I think, like to put it that way, because then they put you in a category for life. It's just like, when you're a kid saying, well, this is going to go on your permanent record, that kind of thing. But do you feel resentment as drugs have affected your life, that much of this was caused by the powers that be that are supposedly supposed to be protecting us and taking care of our population?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I got addicted to drugs, it was part of this wave that I think many people experienced in the United States. If you were in your late teens, 20s, or maybe even older, you just happened to get hooked on drugs. But between 2003, 2006, and 7, there was a flood of crystal meth into the United States. And, I wasn't even living in the city at that time. My parents had moved us out of the city into a suburb that they thought was going to be nicer and safer. And I got, hooked on crystal meth out there. And there was plenty of people that I knew that were involved in that. And I got pulled into it, in the drug stealing side of things, as well as the using side of things. And to later, like I said, get out and then learn a little bit more about the history of the drug war. And even now, I mean, just this last night, I was reading about the CIA and some of the cartels in Mexico, and the fact that there have been Mexican presidents that have also been CIA informants. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. intelligences, if they really wanted to wipe out the crime in Mexico, they could. If they wanted to help the U.S. government, the Mexican government shape up and get rid of the corruption, they could. But it serves the intelligence agencies' goals to some degree or another, and so they have allowed it to fester to this point. My father died of a drug overdose 6 years ago. One of my best friends died of a drug overdose 2 years ago. One of my other best friend's sisters died of fentanyl at age 18. Like, this is something I've seen directly, and felt and been impacted. I've been to the funerals. I've cried those tears. And to know that, there's one thing of like, those dang cartels, they're corrupt and they're evil. And absolutely, I think some of the people in cartels fit that definition. But again, their actions are not just being done on their own independently. There is definitely some support and some elements of the CIA and intelligence agencies in the U.S. government who are involved and who allow this to proceed for one reason or another. I can't claim to be an expert on it, but absolutely. I mean, the data's out there, the historical data is out there, and I think we would be foolish to assume that this just stopped, that they just one day decided, never mind, we're not going to work with the cartels anymore. And to the other point about, idea that people who get addicted to drugs are like, you're forever an addict. Like, props to whoever, if that serves you, if that's the kind of approach you want to take, then so be it. But I have always found that to be a very disempowering message personally. I had to go to treatment centers and do AA and this sort of stuff as part of my parole and probation requirements, but it didn't click for me. Again, props to whoever those programs work for. Personally, I find it very depressing. And you go in there and there's just people who are of all ages, but people who probably been going to AA for 30, 40 years telling themselves that, just take it one day at a time. Once an addict, I'm always an addict. I've got a disease, and this kind of mentality, not only like for my conspiratorial mind, this serves the insurance companies and the people who want to then try to sell you, you need treatment forever because you're always an addict. You're always on the edge about to turn into what you used to be, or things like that. And again, there are a lot of us who struggle in different ways. I think it really goes back to, you need to work on that trauma I was talking about earlier, because my drug addiction and my drug use was really just a symptom of the traumas I had from my lack of relationship with my father and having to visit him in prison. And I didn't, of course, understand that till much later, but typically the roots of addiction have to do with personal traumas. So if you address those personal traumas, then why would you need to tell somebody that they're an addict for the rest of their life, right? I think for some people, unfortunately, that idea that I'm a drug addict, once an addict, I'm always an addict, so it's something I got to be on my toes about all the time. It's kind of just like another crutch for them. It becomes that way, at least in my perspective. So again, no disrespect to anybody who that sort of thinking works for you. But no, I definitely don't consider myself a drug addict these days. I've conquered those things, and I'm grateful for it. I feel blessed that I went through some of my hardest times at a young age so that I could then spend the rest of my life trying to help other people and share my story. I mean, this is why I share it so publicly, and I don't have any shame or guilt or need to hide from it, because I mean, everybody goes through different things. Drug addiction affects people from all walks of life, all uh, classes, all living standards, all nationalities, ethnicities, religions, etc. It can happen to anybody. And I've noticed over the years when I share this story, typically somebody, especially if I'm speaking publicly in an event, somebody will come up to me and say, "Thank you for sharing that. I'm dealing with this addiction right now, and you just helped me." Or, "I've never touched drugs in my life, but I've struggled in this way or that way." Or, "I had a family member who was an addict, and thank you for sharing that story. That's helping me out." And so to me, there's power in kind of claiming that, like, yeah, I used to be a drug addict. I had some rough years, but I'm not anymore. And if I can share that and be vocal about it and help other people who are struggling, and again, with that added context that they're not just struggling because of their own, horrible, their own misdeeds or bad choices. That's part of it. But if we didn't have this whole drug cartel, CIA complex thing going on, maybe drugs wouldn't be as prevalent and pushed in people's face as they are.
I agree. And I think you've done a great job of getting beyond the stigma, because there is a whole stigma where people see drug addicts differently. And it's kind of like, back in the day, homosexuals were seen as off. And James Baldwin, the writer, they asked him, "Why did you decide to come out?" And he said, "So nobody could blackmail me. You didn't tell me, I told you." And I think it's the same way. I don't think people who have had addiction problems or any other problems should have to hide it. And I don't think that it should be something that you carry for the rest of your life as a scarlet letter or anything like that. People, especially when you're young, society drags you in so many different directions that it's really hard to navigate. And especially if you don't have guidance from your family or other people. I know that we're coming to a point where you're going to need to take off, but I wanted to thank you so much for coming on here. Where can the people find you in social media and anywhere else?
Yeah, so my main website is theconsciousresistance.com, and that'll link you to all the various places are. If you're on, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, you can either just search my name, Derrick Broze, or The Conscious Resistance, and you'll find me there. I do have an Instagram account. I'm on a lot of alternative platforms: Odyssey, BitChute, Rockfin, Hive. If you don't know what those are, check them out at my website, theconsciousresistance.com. I'm on Substack as well. I mean, I'm pretty much on the majority of platforms, as well as put out audio versions of all my work on Spotify and things like that. And if anybody's interested in just learning more about my personal background, my website for that is just my name, derrickbroze.com. And and I encourage everybody just to check out my work, check out what I'm doing, and feel free to reach out if you've got questions or thoughts, especially if I know we've talked about a lot about addiction today in this conversation, and that is something that I feel very passionate about, and that in the coming years my work is going to focus more and more on, because as I mentioned, I lost my birth father to a drug addiction. He struggled with drug addiction his whole life, and I've lost some good friends to it, too many to count on one hand. And it's something that I do care about deeply. And whether that means just having a conversation with somebody who's struggling or offering a bit of advice, I'm always happy to do so, because I think that is not one of the major political topics that gets all the clicks and the views and everything, but it's something that affects millions and millions of people. And if we can stop one person from going down that road and potentially losing their life because of things like fentanyl. I mean, it's not the same drug scene it was when I was using drugs 20 years ago. I mean, like I said, with a friend's sister, she wasn't a drug addict. She was going out to party with some friends on a weekend, and the pills that they took that they thought they were going to have a good time with had fentanyl, and then that was it. So if we can help anybody else avoid these traumas and avoid these struggles, then I would love to do so. So please feel free to reach out to me at theconsciousresistance.com or through derrickbroze.com. And I really appreciate you having me on, man, and let me share a little bit about my work.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, and I'd like to invite you to come on again, because we haven't really talked about a lot of the news stories that are going on currently. Of course, there's the presidential debates and everything else. There's a lot going on in the world, and a lot that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So I appreciate.
I'd love to come back and dive into the news. You let me know and we'll make it happen.
That sounds great. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Thanks to all my friends. And we will have another episode tomorrow in Spanish again. Most of our episodes are in Spanish, but we do have episodes in English. And I think that it's nice to be able to do both, because it reaches a wider audience. And that way, hopefully, some people will become aware of your work in other parts of the world as well. So
thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next time. Ciao.